Good morning, everyone. Perfectly timed music, Lindsay. That beautiful piece of music was the Sussex Waltz from the CD The Regency Ballroom by Spare Parts. Liz Stell, Bill Matheson, Eric Buddington, a wonderful band. We're going to post in the chat box where you can buy that CD and these credits. First, some management. We're the Historical Tea and Dance Society. I'm Darlene Hamilton. We have Lindsay helping out, doing the behind the scenes work. She is going to be taking in all your questions that you may have for Susan. And the way you do that is if you are in our Zoom meeting, usually down at the bottom, you'll see chat. Please open your chat window and type in there. And if you're on Facebook Live, please type in your questions in the chat box because Lindsay is monitoring both places. It's amazing. She does such a good job of it. So let's see. What next? What next indeed? Oh, stick around for the after talk. Stick around for the after talk. After this 1 hour, those of you who signed up on Zoom will have already received the after talk link. We changed to a different format where you can get more personal and face-to-face with Susan. And if you did not sign up, we post the link on our Historical Tea and Dance Friends page for those people who are friends of our group. So you'll be able to join us that way. And let's see, oh boy, I'm not much of a morning person, stumbling this morning. I want to go right into introducing Susan, and I want to start this off by saying that I've met a lot of dance historians and I so admire them, and they're opinionated and very strong in their convictions, and the reason is because they truly love dance. So stick around, you're going to learn some very interesting things. And you'll also see how Susan's love of dance brought her to being so passionate about it. So if you don't happen to agree with something, don't worry, because we're all in it for the dance. And I'm sort of saying this for a caveat for the people who aren't as historian-minded as Susan is. Susan is one of the world's foremost specialists on early 19th century dance. She literally has the equivalent of a doctorate in this stuff, so it's pretty amazing to talk to her. She teaches dance and lectures all around the world, as well as Canada, England, Russia, where she has mostly lived since 2016. She has taught dance reconstruction at Pinewoods English Dance Week. She has choreographed for dance academies and theater and for A&E in their Jane Austen special. She writes about a wide variety of dance. If you have not been to her website, Capery and Kickery, we are going to post the link. It's amazing. So truly, you should spend some time going to that website. And without further ado, let me introduce to you Susan de Guardiola. Thank you so much for joining us. It's so
Hello.
nice to see you.
It's great to see everyone here and to see a lot of friends in the chat too who have
Good, good.
joined because for some reason they haven't heard me talk to them enough over Zoom in the last couple of months.
I think perhaps they have heard you talk, and that's why they're here because they love it. I was blown away at our prep work discussion and just learning so much stuff about this. So, Lindsay, too. So, thank you. So, let's get into the first thing. Thing number one, your beginnings. And I love it, prancing around in pretty flocks. And boy, pretty frocks. Can't we all
Yeah,
relate to
frocks,
that?
not flocks. Yeah. Yeah, so this was back in the early 1980s. I was a reader of both Jane Austen and the modern Regency romances, well, relatively modern, written by Georgette Heyer. And I had become a passionate fan of the Regency period because of this. I was also interested in making costumes. I was doing them for science fiction conventions, Renaissance fairs, things like that, and doing a little bit of theater in high school, for which I was doing a lot of costumes. So the idea that I could go to a ball just like the ones in these books, and it would be an excuse to have a pretty Regency dress and, yeah, prance around in a pretty frock, just like, you know, you can see on television or read about in a book. So that was really how it started for me. And my early dance experience was, you know, English country dancing, wearing pretty Regency frock. Or actually, I think at my very first one, I was wearing a sort of scary 1970s polyester angel sleeve but high-waisted dress that I borrowed because I hadn't expected to do this and didn't actually have a pretty Regency frock. That didn't come until a couple of years later. But yeah, initially the impetus came from the chance to go to events in costume. It wasn't really about the dancing at all at first. And then I discovered that I really, really, really loved the dancing. And it's been, I guess, 38 years now since that first dance. And well, obviously it changed my life.
That's a great story, and I'm sure so many of us can relate to that. It definitely sounds like the beginnings of a lot of us, and yet you took it so much further. That was great. Your thing number two is words to movement and the
Yeah.
whole reconstruction aspect.
Mm-hmm. So several years, over a decade after that that first dance, I had become involved in historical dancing in what's in the US called the vintage dance community, which focused at the time primarily on Victorian and ragtime era dance, so mid 19th century to early 20th century. And I was making costumes and going to balls for that. I'd also started studying dance more formally, and what I was studying was Renaissance and a little bit of Baroque dance with a teacher, Dominique Bourassa, at the neighborhood music school in New Haven, which incidentally at the time was also home to New Haven's English country dance group under the leadership of Marshall Barron, who's a fantastic English country dance musician. So I was doing a little English country dance here and there, but I was studying Renaissance dance. And as part of our classes in Renaissance dance, our teacher expected us to actually look at the historical dance sources in translation because we were studying French and Italian dance. So we were looking at them in English, and then we were actually looking at diagrams of the Baroque dances that we were studying. So that got me the idea that I could actually look at the historical sources and do something with them. It was then in the very late 90s, I don't remember exactly which year, at a vintage dance week in Cincinnati, Ohio, where two of the more senior dance historians, Richard Powers from California and the late Patrick Pugliese from Boston, offered a 5-day seminar, just an hour a day, on dance reconstruction. And they gave us sources of various kinds for different types of dance, quadrilles, couple dances, all sorts of things. And I was absolutely fascinated by this. More or less simultaneously with that, I had a group of friends who wanted to start doing more Regency dancing, and they sort of elected me their teacher on the grounds that I was the best dancer in the group. Had nothing to do with being a dance historian or a dance researcher. I really wasn't that yet, but they decided, well, you're the best dancer, so you're in charge. Lucky you. And then I took this seminar, and that was kind of a life-changing event because it was the first time I'd really looked at 19th century sources. And they are, well, easier and more accessible because primarily in English for the sources we looked at, but also more solvable. They're something that you can get a fairly good approximation of what they were doing. You can get pretty close to actually understanding. It's less guesswork than you'll see in the earlier material. So at this point, I had a problem. I had recently left my job working in the television industry, and I was in graduate school getting a master's of education in English. And I realized after taking that seminar that I'd made kind of a dreadful mistake in my life, that I didn't want to be an English teacher, I wanted to be a dance historian. And this is an inconvenient thing to realize when you're in the middle of a master's program. So I completed my degree, and I did teach high school English for a few years. And during that time, I sort of schemed and planned and eventually quit that job and started working at various temp jobs and turning myself into a dance historian, studying as full-time as I could manage. For about a decade, I sort of cycled in and out of full-time day jobs and part-time jobs and focusing entirely on dance history, the absolute despair of my family, I think. And then at the end of that, about 10 or 12 years ago, I quit my last day job entirely and started doing the dance history stuff full-time with just occasional bouts of day job to, keep the bills paid in times when things were a little bit tighter. So the fascination for me with the dance history was the puzzle aspect. I was a Sherlock Holmes fan from way back when, along with Jane Austen. And for me, doing the dance history with these historical sources was like the most fun mystery solving project puzzle ever. That I could take these diagrams, take these kind of cryptic descriptions, and through research and experimentation, I could turn these words and these pictures on the page into movement and have a whole room full of people then doing those movements that I had reconstructed. And into this, I could also bring my interest in music, my interest in foreign languages. I spent a memorable 6 weeks teaching myself to read 16th century Italian so that I could read Renaissance sources in the original, which consisted mostly of reading and reading and reading until it all made sense. But all of this coming together was absolutely fascinating. Throughout all this, I was still dancing. I was still going to balls. I was doing primarily historical balls at that point and dabbling a little bit in swing dance as well, and occasionally other forms. I went through a bit of flamenco for a while, a little bit of Middle Eastern, things like that. But through it all, I was absorbed in this sudden wonderful transition of instructions on paper into live people moving and dancing. I'd always enjoyed history, but this is history you could bring to life, and not in the sort of depressing way of, say, reenacting a battle, which is exciting to watch, but also sad in a way. I don't really want to bring war to life on a personal basis, although I respect people who enjoy that form of reenactment. But the idea we could bring the social life of past times to life again and enjoy it ourselves, that was absolutely fascinating to me.
That's wonderful. I love it. Um, Thank you. It's so relatable too. um, so can
It
we?
was all a terrible accident. This wasn't actually my life plan. I didn't set out when I was 12 deciding to be a dance historian. I didn't really even have any idea that was possible. It just happened.
I love that. I love that, and I love that you were passionate enough to just say, "I'm going for it."
Well, it took a good 12 or 14 years of going for it before I could actually go for it, professionally, because dance historian is not a normal full-time job unless you're one of the very few who has something like a university appointment or a job, say, at an opera house or a theater.
Yeah.
Um, freelance dance historian, that's almost deranged. So,
Now, can we talk a minute about your mentor, Patry? Because I've been in this community on the West Coast for about 30 years, and we hear the name, but he wasn't out here that we were familiar with. At least I wasn't familiar with, and there's a lot of mystery about him. In a sense, we know he was brilliant and wonderful, but I know he was your mentor. So I'd love if you'd talk a few minutes about him. That'd be great.
So Patrick Pugliese was the leader, one of the leaders, the co-leader of the Commonwealth Vintage Dancers. It's a group based out of Boston, still in existence today. His specialty was the American Civil War era, the middle of the 19th century, and he did both, not sure what you'd call it, non-dance reenacting, normal reenacting, as well as studying the dance very intensely. He was one of the people who had taught that seminar in Cincinnati back in the late 90s, whenever it was, and that I'd learned from. And when I decided that I wanted to apply the type of work I'd been doing in Renaissance dance and the type of work I'd been doing in Victorian and ragtime dance, Patry was the person I turned to. And by turn to, I mean, I more or less turned up on his doorstep and said, help, I need some sources, I need some material. Can you please help me with all of this? He was incredibly generous with his time and in his advice and with sources. Some of this was back before we had all the wonderful things we have now with Google Books and libraries putting their books online and the Library of Congress. Patry had an enormous physical library of 19th century books, including a lot of Regency books, and he would make photocopies of those. And he had a sort of, I won't call it a side business, I don't think he was making any money on it, a sideline where he was photocopying all of these books in his collection and sending them out to anyone who'd send him, the cost of copies and postage. So he gave me just stacks and stacks of material and a lot of guidance about how to use it. I was enough of a self-starter that I didn't need to be taught sort of how to reconstruct a dance. That was fairly obvious to me. You read the directions and figure it out. But as a mentor, what I remember and value most is what he taught me about a sort of philosophies of reconstruction or ethics of reconstruction, I guess might be part of that. In particular, he was not afraid to be challenged. He wasn't afraid to be wrong. And he taught me not to just sort of listen blindly to whatever other people had told me, to actually go back and look at the books. I have a memorable moment with Patry when I had challenged one of his reconstructions, said, I don't think this is right. And without a word, he turned and marched out of the room. And I thought, oh my God, I've just offended him. He came back and he thumped about a 12-inch high stack of historical sources in front of me and said, look it up for yourself. And I sat at the table and looked it up for myself until I could come to a conclusion about whether I agreed with him or not. At this point, I don't ever remember if I agreed with him on that particular point. But he didn't expect me to take his word for it. He was very encouraging of original research. Another important thing he taught me is that as a historian, you can't be afraid to be wrong, especially in a new field like historical dance research. And by new, I mean it's only really been sort of academically respectable for maybe the last 50 years or so. The late 19th and early 20th century stuff, well, it had its moments when it was right, and then it had a lot of moments which were not as right, shall we say. But academically, it's only been really high quality since the middle of the 20th century. So by comparison to a lot of academic fields, that's brand new. And the number of sources which are being unearthed mean that you can easily be, undermined just by the discovery of a new source that just, tells you that what you were doing before is wrong. So another moment that I remember very clearly from him is I did disagree with him on something, and I looked at the source. That was what we always did. We went to the sources. And he looked at it for a while and he said, well, you're right. I'm wrong. I guess I'll have to change what I'm doing. And that's enormously difficult as a historian, as an academic, as a teacher. You feel kind of silly or stupid. You might look kind of stupid to go back to your students and say, hey, guess what? I've been telling you the wrong thing. And now we have to change. So, when that's happened to me, and it does happen to me periodically, I try to remember, well, I'm wrong. Okay, I guess I have to change what I'm doing. And as a teacher and mentor, that's an incredibly valuable lesson to have if you're working in an academic field, even if you're working independently in an academic field.
And that's great. Yes. And that leads right into number 3. Now, let me say, this is usually where we take a question or two, and there are definitely some questions out there. However, I think we want to wait just a little bit and possibly speak a little bit more with Susan because she has so many different interesting things to say. And then we are aware of your questions out there. Be patient with us. So, thing number 3, everything they told me was wrong. I love that.
Yes. So this was after I had collared Patry and more or less mugged him for Regency sources, which he was very good natured about. Um, I then, as soon as I looked at those, came to the horrific realization that everything I had thought about Regency dance previously, from not having studied it in any formal way, just what I picked up at balls in various places, was completely and utterly wrong. So that the dances I had been doing were not from the Regency era. The style I had been using was not Regency style. That there was just about nothing that was correct about it. I went through the first of 2 cycles of changing everything I was doing, which is that I went back to my group, my little New York-based group of Regency dancers, and said, guess what? All these dances you've learned so meticulously and love, well, we're not going to do them anymore because none of them are actually Regency. Half my students promptly quit. So, which was sad, but I guess was sort of necessary there. But I couldn't really bear to be in the position where I was saying we're doing Regency dancing while knowing we weren't doing Regency dancing. I just can't bring myself to do that sort of on an ethical level. I'd be lying to them, and I can't perpetuate, that kind of lie or that kind of mistake. So we switched over to doing dance figures from the Regency era. We started using footwork instead of just doing the sort of stately walking that you see in films, in which I had originally been taught was that Regency dancing should be all stately walking. Well, that wasn't true either.
Susan?
Yes?
Susan, sorry to interrupt. Your mic's having a little bit of an issue. Can you try moving it a little further from your mouth if possible? Or maybe turning it off?
Further from my mouth. How's that?
Oh, no help, I'm afraid. Let's try turning it off and back on again real quick.
Yep, that's what I'm doing. Okay, hang on a moment. Now I've got to reset all my audio here.
Sorry.
Okay, how's that?
Much better, thank you.
Okay. Technology.
Yes. Okay, so we were talking about footwork, I believe.
Yes. So I started incorporating footwork and more authentic Regency dance figures. And I achieved sort of a new equilibrium with doing this, a new repertoire of dances. Dug up a new set of music to use, and everything was going along swimmingly. And then, well, this is thing 4. Then I came to, well, another set of conclusions. Darlene, do you want to transition us neatly into thing 4 here, or should I just go on myself?
I will transition us into thing 4. Thing 4. People of the past are aliens.
Yes, people of the past are aliens. So that was my epiphany, and I can't remember exactly when this was, sometime in the early 2000s, that it wasn't so much that I needed to understand the dance figures and the dance technique, although that was important, but that I needed to really understand the mindset. I needed to understand the context of these dances. And one of the things that's said only indirectly, or not said explicitly, you have to read between the lines, but once you drop modern assumptions, it's there, is that the modern model of choreographed figures by a known choreography with a fixed piece of music called by a dance caller who's in charge of directing the dancing and in charge of the room is a more modern model. It's not totally a modern model because it did develop it later in the 19th century. But for Regency England, it doesn't seem to be the actual model. And that I had spent a number of years turning myself into an accomplished caller of Regency dance figures, and thereby created a totally ahistorical role for myself. Much as we as dancers would love to think everything's about the dance, what I eventually realized was that most of the sources I had amassed were actually sources for music. The dance figures were incidental, they were trivial, they were repeated. The most dramatic version of this I have is a set of figures which nowadays is known as the dance Dutch dollars. which I found associated with 64 different pieces of music, which makes the entire concept that that's a dance named Dutch dollars just impossible. It doesn't make any sense. It has 64 different names. You know, people didn't notice that they had 64 different dances that were exactly the same. That doesn't seem right either. And I realized that I needed to sort of wash my mind of all my modern assumptions about dance as a concept and choreography and the concept of a dance, and really open myself to what they were doing and expecting. Why, you know, do you so rarely see the names of dances and descriptions of a historical ball? Why do we have sources where the dances figures don't have any names? They have numbers, you know, figure 1, figure 2, figure 3. Why do we have suggestions that if you don't like, you know, this piece of music, you can just switch to a different one? You know, all of this challenges the modern conception of what a country dance is. And because I was originally completely blinded by, at that point, a good 20 years of knowing what a country dance is, because of course we all know what a country dance is, I completely missed this for years. Once I realized that I needed to let go of that model in favor of something a lot more like modern contra dance, where tunes and figures are mixed with abandon by the choice of the caller and the musicians, it became clear to me that that was a more likely model for Regency dancing, and that it was completely compatible with what I was seeing in the sources, including the dozens of pages of instructions on how a dancer could compose their own figures. You know, that wasn't aimed at professional choreographers. That was aimed at average dancers who didn't depend on a caller to tell them their figures, who called their own figures to the set. You know, we have the example of Jane Austen in one of her letters describing a dance she went to. I believe in this one, she sort of sarcastically refers to it as a ball, even though there weren't very many couples. But she talks about all of her dance partners, and at the end she says, well, and my last partner was such and such, with whom I called the last, meaning with whom she called the last dance. You know, there wasn't a caller directing them. The dancers in the sets were calling the dances. And once I reframed myself to look at it like this, you know, I couldn't believe how much evidence I had overlooked just because I had been so stuck in that modern mindset, the way I'd been dancing for 20 years. You know, I was completely shocked. And once again, I realized I had been totally wrong in what I was teaching my dancers, that we needed to not make our metric for being a good Regency dancer how many dances you can memorize. So this was a noticeably harder sell to people because it challenges, you know, their entire conception of what a dance is, or, you know, or historically was, and goes completely against what you see in modern traditional forms of dancing. So once again, I lost a bunch of students, and I was never really able to turn all my students into, you know, callers of Regency dance. What I was able to do is change how I thought of dances and let go of the idea that I need to memorize fixed sets of figures, you know, and that a ball should consist of a sort of program list of named dances. So, and that influenced how I conducted balls, how I taught classes, how I thought of figures, and how all that operated in my own head. You know, I stopped trying to memorize dances and started working on the skill of composing dances. And I don't consider this to be an amazing act of choreography any more than, say, choosing from the menu at McDonald's is an amazing act of, you know, menu planning. You know, it's literally one from column A, one from column B, one from column C, and then you have a dance. But I eventually trained myself to do this kind of composition and to do it, as we'd say, on the fly, which is to say to stand up at the top of a set and poof, call a dance. My skills in that are probably now higher than the average level in Jane Austen's time. I think we have some evidence that Jane Austen did the same thing and made some notes about her dances in advance rather than just, you know, coming up with them. But this made sense of the charts for composing dances, the playing cards for composing dances. You know, a number of sets of those exist from continental Europe. That was a thing people did. The most extreme version of it I've seen is a set of musical playing cards, which were for composing waltzes. And they were literally two-bar bits of waltz music. And the idea is that you would stick a bunch of these together and you would have a waltz tune, which to us just sounds deranged. I mean, music doesn't work that way. But apparently music could work that way, and dance definitely could work that way. So this was another of these, oh my God, everything I've been doing is wrong moments. And really realizing that I needed to stop having any modern assumptions if I could manage it about the past. That it was not just that they did different figures wearing pretty clothes. It was that they thought of and conceived of dances and balls very differently than we did nowadays.
Wow, that's very interesting. Now I have to ask, because you did say this was a hard sell. So have you ever gotten a chance to actually dance in this manner, be the first lady?
So that's been my biggest problem, because this is not something that you can quickly teach people to do. It takes time, it takes confidence to teach people to conduct a ball like this. With my students in the past, we would cheat a little, which is we'd set up the figures in advance, and they would actually have like a little palm card where they had the notes on what figures they were going to call to their set. They wouldn't have it all by memory. So we were giving others in the set that experience. But for the most part, and very frustratingly, I was always outside, always acting, historically, as a dance caller at Regency balls, which drove me crazy. That wasn't the experience I wanted to have. It's necessary because we live in the real world. We live in the modern world. I can't expect everyone to drop their lives and learn how to be good Regency dance composers and callers on the spot. But it was very frustrating to me to never really get that experience. So happily, I have had a chance to have this experience. In the spring of 2017, I was at a ball conducted by a Moscow dance studio, that's Moscow, Russia, Tanets Vizhny, which is Dance of Spring. And they were holding a ball and wanted to hold it on these principles. So I was delighted that I wouldn't have to be in charge of the ball. I was there as an honored guest, and as the guest of rank, I was given the head of the first set and the job of calling the first country dance for my set. And the organizer of the ball acted appropriately as the master of ceremonies. In this case, that included translating the instructions into Russian for people, but also communicating my instructions to the other set and to the rest of the room so I didn't have to yell, and communicating to the musicians. And I got to be within the historical role as the first lady in a set calling a dance. And it was a wonderful experience. And then after the refreshment break, I got to have it again because they said, well, would you mind calling a second dance? So at that point, I then took my refreshments and went off into a little corner because I was just nervous enough about the whole prospect that I didn't want to just stand up at the top of the set and make something up on the fly. Operating in a Russian context adds enough stress, enough difficulty for me that I didn't want to just totally make it up. So I sat there having my little cake and sandwiches and composing another country dance in my head, because I knew I needed something that would both be impressive enough to be what people expected of the exotic foreign dance teacher in the room, but also something that I could reasonably expect the people in the room to do, keeping in mind that while they were technically accomplished dancers, operating in this way without a previously memorized dance was still difficult and challenging. There are videos of both these dances on YouTube, which I can post in the group at some point, and you can see the sort of mild chaos in the sets as people start the first few rounds of the dance, and then they make mistakes, and then they recover, and then eventually we're all dancing happily. So that was a memory I cherish of getting to actually reenact the historical role as it should be, rather than constantly being outside the set calling country dances, which isn't the model I want to exist in.
That's great. We are going to bring up a question. Lindsay.
Okay.
Awesome. All right, I am bringing David Millstone online.
Hello, David.
Unmute, start video. It's hi there. Hi,
Hello.
Susan.
Hi there. We all have a learning curve with the technology nowadays.
Well, I had to turn myself on. So I would love it if you could talk some about, well, let me back up. The whole contra dance movement really took off in the late 60s and 70s. Young people were sort of back to the land, rebelling against America in the 50s, looking for something different. I'd love to know what it is in Russia that prompted so many young people to get excited about dance. Is this a return to the glory of the Russian Empire? Is it a reaction to current society? Just why is it this movement is developed? Thanks.
That's, it's a question that probably ought to be asked of Russians more than of me. Let me first note that we need to be careful with our American-centric perspective, for those of us here who are American, with conflating a recent development versus us noticing it relatively recently. In 2011, I was the first American teacher to teach at a historical dance festival in Russia, but that was already the 11th year of their dance festival, and they had an active dance community of various kinds going since, I think, sometime in the mid to late 90s. The historical quality of that, of course, has varied over the years, and I would say in the last 10 or 15 years, it's become noticeably more advanced on historical accuracy. But even when I arrived in 2011, there was a substantial group of people waiting at the festival who were already extremely accomplished historical dancers. This was not a case of America bringing something to them they didn't already have. As to why, why is always the hardest question to answer. Why does anything become popular? Why do people love My Little Pony, Friendship is Magic? I don't get it. I've watched it, and yet it's enormously popular. I think that there is, to some degree, a nostalgia for some of the beauties of the past, because, of course, Russia in the 20th century had a notably rough time for many decades. And I noticed, for example, in Russia, there's a lot more 18th century dance done on a social basis than I've ever seen anywhere else in the world. And I think part of that is the appeal of, times when Russia was a huge socio-political, cultural, military power there on the edge of Western Europe. But I think in a lot of ways, it's as simple as, what brought me into it, originally, which is the desire of creative young people to be beautiful and do beautiful dances and act beautiful parts of history. I don't know that it has to be more complicated than that. I will say that the Russian dance community, as far as I can tell, and this is a large part of the reason why I ended up in Russia, is enormous. When I go to balls in Moscow, I usually have a choice of 2 or 3 per weekend, sometimes 2 or 3 per night. And there's people who are doing very strict historical balls. There's people who are doing vaguely historical balls. There's people doing balls with a very strange mix of Russian traditional and Soviet traditional and historical, with the occasional modern Western square dance thrown in. There would be a whole PhD thesis in figuring out where all of these different threads of dance, came into the Russian dance community. But Russia as a culture, to speak very, very, generally, I find has got a greater respect for art and music and dance than a lot of Americans do. And I would say present company accepted, because, hey, we're all here. But it's very much in their culture, this interest in, dance and music and art, in a way that it isn't necessarily in America. So it doesn't entirely surprise me that a group of young people would see this as a fun activity, for all the same reasons that it was a fun activity for me when I was 14.
Prancing
so,
around.
but some of the people I've met in this, there's one gentleman I've met, he's got to be probably in his late 70s, 80s, maybe older than that. He's been doing historical dance of various sorts in Russia since the Soviet era. Talking to him. So it's not a recent thing. in the sense of like in the last 5 or 10 years or so. It goes back much further than that. And I don't know all of the sort of historical threads that come into it.
Thank you.
That's really interesting. So make sure you all join us in the after chat because there's going to be a lot more questions. Dave, I'm going to let Lindsay take over for a minute.
Oh, well, David, you actually had another question going back to quadrilles and cotillions versus long ways.
Oh, I have to find my chat window again. Get it. There it is. Da da da. Da da. Dude. There we go. So this was a question just I was thrilled when you were invited to be on this program because
thank you. So was I.
I don't get to talk to you very often. So as you know, I mean, early 19th century, we have a lot of long ways dances. And by the time we move into the century, it's quadrilles. So I'd love to hear you talk about why that change comes about.
We're back to the why questions, which again are difficult to answer because people don't generally write down why. Why does fashion change? Why does music change? I can offer you my informed speculation. By the beginning of the 19th century, for the most part, judging by published sets of dance figures, which I don't call dances because, again, I'm trying to get away from that mindset, country dancing had become senescent. It had become boring. There are enormous numbers of printed dance figures, which are something like right hands across, left hands back, down the middle, up again, turn your partner, and that's the dance. 16 bars of not very exciting figures, what in contra dance nowadays are called glossary figures, very standardized figures. Thomas Wilson, who was a Regency dancing master, a London dancing master, complained bitterly in his litany of complaints that that people who called dances, that the dancers, that the ladies in the sets who called the dances were not ambitious, that they were calling boring dances. They were only calling stupid 16-bar easy figures, that nobody was interested in being challenged by this anymore. And most of the public figures by the early 19th century do reflect that. The publishers were getting a little lazy. They were repeating a lot of figures, and that had happened since the late 18th century, but it was ridiculous in the early 19th century. You can find books of music with the same figures attached to 4 or 5 different pieces of music in the same book, sometimes on facing pages. So the dances, I hate to say, are kind of boring as far as the larger context of English country dance. I tell people if you want really cool English country dances, really creative figures, you need to go back to the older stuff, the stuff before 1740 or so. There's a lot more exciting stuff going on then. The Regency era dances, you're lucky when you get good combinations. Now, some of these publishers did get a little more ambitious. For example, Thomas Wilson was hired by some publishers to write dance figures for their books, and Wilson published lots and lots and lots of long, complicated figure combinations. But I don't get the sense that that was what most people were doing. The balls where we have records of what music was used, the music tends to be older common tunes, not all these new published tunes. And I've no real evidence that the figures ever got very, very complicated, even though it was theoretically possible. So I think the problem is that country dancing was collectively, an old, somewhat antiquated dance form by that time. The version of it that went across the ocean to America developed different characteristics and lasted longer, at least in certain parts of America, particularly the New England area where I'm from. But in England, it was not that exciting. And then you have the effect of the politics, the history of the era, which is the Napoleonic Wars. You had Europe at war for well over a decade, depending on exactly how you define at war and how you account for the breaks in the war. In the wake of that enormous, enormous upheaval, when you start having a lot more commerce finally between the European continent and England, you've got the ability to bring in a whole lot of new dances. You have the ability to travel to Europe and see what they're doing. And you have the Europeans coming, especially during the peace talks in the mid-18 teens of various sorts, Europeans coming to London and bringing their dances with them. And we know the names of some of these people, who brought these dances. We know some of the European nobility. We know some of the English nobility who brought these different styles back. So I think it's in a large part as simple as country dancing had become not that exciting. It wasn't just your parents' dance, it was your great, 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 great grandparents' dance form. It had a 150-year history at that point. And these new dances were, interesting and exciting. You asked about the quadrille in particular, why quadrilles supplanted country dance. Quadrilles were a great way of first not having to mix with a large set of people, and secondly of showing off your steps, because typically only between 1 and 4 people danced at once. In a quadrille with only 2 couples, even fewer, just a maximum of 4. But even in a quadrille of 4 couples, the most is 8. And you have a lot of opportunities for solo dancing, for showing off fancy steps, and for dancing in just a small elite group of your closest friends, rather than an enormous country dance that might take 45 minutes to go through. A quadrille takes 10 minutes to go through. So I think they found this exciting, and I can see why. If I had done nothing but little 16-bar stupid English country dances for 5 years, I would probably find a quadrille extremely exciting too. It's variety.
I love that. Thank you, David. Thank you for coming on. And we had a couple questions because we want to move on and get through all the 5 things. But we did have a couple questions coming in asking about the calling aspect. And I remember in a chat with you, you were talking about the function of the caller at a historical ball, and you touched on it when you talked about your experience in Russia. So let's have you just answer that question really quickly rather than bring somebody up.
So what precisely is the question, I guess?
So the question that a lot of people are asking is, when the First Lady was calling the dance, was she standing at the lead calling it? Was she demoing it? Was she in the dance or out of the dance? These are the questions.
Okay, so she would have been in the dance. And the way, and we have fairly extensive documentation of this, the way a public assembly was organized, and this applies, by the way, both in England and in America, for which we have the rules of assemblies, as well as some letters documenting practice, is you would have a place in the set. In some assemblies, you'd actually have a number either assigned to you or literally drawn out of a hat and like pinned to the lady's dress. And the first lady and if there were multiple sets, the first lady in the first set would determine what was to be danced, what dance figure and what music should be played for it. And if the dance was only one set, then she could just tell the other dancers, or one American source says, I'm paraphrasing, that if the lady is very nice, they could walk through the figure once to demonstrate it for people. But otherwise could just tell the dancers, who, remember, would know these figures. Just like if we say 2-hand turn, we don't need that demonstrated. We know how to do a turn. If you say, do sa do, we know how to do a do sa do. It doesn't have to be explained to us. Experienced dancers are familiar with these figures already. So she would call the dance, and then she and her partner and the first 2 couples in the set would begin the dance. Everyone else in the set would watch, and as the dance progressed down until everyone was in motion, they would, eventually begin dancing, themselves. Something I've observed doing this in the wild with starts at the top of the set like this is that there are a certain type of dancer who's very confident and dashes to be at the top of the set because they want to be in charge and start dancing fast. And there is a certain type of dancer who frantically dashes to be at the very bottom of the set because they want the maximum number of times watching the dance before it actually arrives at their position and they have to be part of it. So the answer to the question is the lady would be in the set. If there were multiple sets, then the call would rotate between the sets, or the first couples in all the sets could try to agree on what they would do. And the role of the master of ceremonies, the person outside the dancing, would be to manage communications between the sets, communications with the musicians, keeping things moving, correctly, making sure that people lined up in the correct order and that each group got, or each couple got, a call of a dance, and that nobody got to call twice until everybody else had already gotten to call. So in a formal setting, a master of ceremonies is enforcing the rules of the assembly. A private ball, I don't know, would have a master of ceremonies in that, but then you would order people by rank. The lady of the highest rank would get the call. You see this in the most exaggerated form at the royal birthday balls in the late 18th century, where most of the people attending were just spectators. The entire dance set, the only people dancing, was formed by the numerous children of George III and his wife. I can't remember exactly how many children they had, but it was easily a dance set's worth. And a few select noble partners for them. And the dancing would be, by order of rank. The first couple in the dance would be the Prince Regent and the well, not the Prince Regent then, but the older son or the Princess Royal, the senior princess. Wow. So it would have been a rank thing. We don't have as much description of these private events except in letters, because obviously private balls don't publish lists of rules in advance the way that public balls did.
Wow,
so I hope that answers the question.
That's so interesting. So we're about 10 minutes away from the hour. I know I told all of you watching how fascinating this was going to be. So let's get to thing number 5, because we still have a few more things to talk about, and come to the after chat the after talk, because we will be bringing up all these other questions because they're really good ones. We're just running out of time. So thing number 5 is you as a public historian and the balance between authenticity and realism. So
yes.
Let's have you talk about that.
So I was a little nervous doing this chat, partly because I worry, I already have a problem with people being a little nervous when I come to a ball or come to a dance. In general, if I come to a ball and a historical ball like in the US, and people correctly identify me as the Susan who's a dance historian, I invariably get an organizer or one of the dancers sort of creeping up next to me and apologetically saying, well, we know this isn't perfectly historical. So guess what? This is not actually news to me. I have, much to my dismay, the world of dancing does not all organize itself into sort of my fantasy perfect historical dance land. I can't imagine what's wrong with the world that it doesn't all organize itself around what I want. Obviously that would be better, at least for me. But I have to also operate in the real world as someone whose vocation and career depends on people engaging me to teach and talk about this stuff. So, what I do as a public historian, as a dance historian, is I give people information. And that might be because they want to do a maximally historically correct ball. That's wonderful. That's sort of my fantasy. I love it when people do that. But it's also in large part people who are just interested in having this information and they enjoy knowing it. Lots of people just love learning this kind of thing. It might inform how they think about dancing or inform their enjoyment of dancing, but it doesn't mean that they're eager to go out and run balls, on that basis. So quite a number of the people I teach and the events that I go to are not particularly historical balls, and I know that, and I'm not bothered by it. I will tend to analyze all the dancing in terms of historical authenticity because that's what I do, but I don't hold I'm not here to sort of sit in moral judgment on people because they don't have a burning desire to be perfectly authentic historical dancers. Now, if they advertise their event as a perfectly authentic historical dance, then I will totally judge it on that basis. But most of the time when I'm going to a ball, I'm going to a ball because I started all this because I loved the dancing. So I'm going to a ball because I love to dance. And if I'm having a lot of fun dancing, then I'm going to enjoy the ball, even if it's not particularly historical. I can simultaneously do my historical analysis, and I can then still have loads of fun at the event. So I don't want people who are listening to this talk to take away from this that Susan is some sort of terrifying scholar who's coming to your balls to take notes on all of your historical failures and things like that. No, I'm trying to give you this information, and I'm overjoyed if you want to use it to make what you're doing more historical or to do some historical events. But I also know that out in the real world, most people are not using it that way. You know, they're enjoying the information, but they're going to continue doing, you know, the sort of dancing that reaches their heart, rather or not, you know, whether or not that's purely historical dancing, and that's fine.
And you do love to dance. You do a lot of different style dancing.
Yeah, I love dancing.
Enjoy a lot of local things annually. Every year you're going to Flurry, and
Mm-hmm.
you've been to New Lenox several times and several other places.
Yeah, I mean, my original dance roots were there in English country dancing, so I still enjoy going to, when I'm in the U.S., the New England Folk Festival, NEFA, the Dance Flurry up in Saratoga. You know, these are my chances to do some English country dancing, to do some contra dancing, which I don't get to do very often, but which I also enjoy. For fun, I do a little bit of swing dance, a little bit of Lindy Hop. I enjoy blues dancing. So, you know, I would enjoy even more forms of dance if I had time to enjoy them. The problem being that even when we're not all locked down in a pandemic, there's only so many weekends in the month and so many nights in a weekend, and, you know, so much time that I have to do them. But I find that enjoying all these different kinds of dance both keeps me fresh as a dancer and a dance teacher and a dance historian, because it reminds me that all of dance is not, you know, some private weird academic pursuit of mine. You know, that it's a living art, a living tradition for many people, with lots of different styles, you know, lots of different attitudes, lots of different approaches to dance. And, you know, it lets me dance, which is, you know, one of the greatest pleasures of my life.
Well, and it shines on your face when you started talking about your love of dance. It was absolutely shining on your face. And
Oh,
this
thank you.
seems like a really good time to make a special announcement, which I told you was coming. And because of our current situation, and we have the availability to tap into teachers all over the place, and it doesn't stop us, we are taking advantage of that. And Susan is about to offer 3 online classes. And the first one is going to be in conjunction with the Historical Tea and Dance Society, and it is going to be a low impact historical footwork class that you can learn in your own home and practice. A 4-week class. You can learn it in your home, practice your footwork, and be silly or make mistakes and not worry too much. And I'm going to have Susan talk about that, because that's going to be coming up. I believe we're going to start on the 30th. I am going to publish information about it this week. Susan, talk to us about that class and your other classes.
So this is something that Darlene and I were talking about.
Oh, no.
It's going to be a low impact introduction to historical footwork for various kinds of dancing. And that's going to include footwork for country dances of different periods. So if you want to know what Regency era dancers were doing instead of stately walking, then we're going to look at those steps. We're going to look at it from a beginner level. I do realize that everybody is not a 12-year-old trained ballet dancer, so we're not going to be doing highly demanding footwork, but we're going to cover enough of the basics that you can get up and dance a Regency era country dance or a Regency era quadrille and feel like, you know, you're experiencing something of what they would have experienced at the time in the quality of movement there. Time permitting, we're also going to look at some of the steps that are particular to the colonial era. So this is the US colonial era for those who are not in the US. So the late 18th century, maybe a little bit with the steps from the Playford area and the early 18th century, or going later, what happened in the mid-19th century when steps mostly started going away and stately walking did in fact become how one does a dance, which it still is to this day in a lot of ways. So we're going to do a 4-week course, be 1-hour classes online. You don't need a partner for this, so it's not going to be couple dancing. but it's going to be a gentle introduction for people who might have been a little nervous about trying to do any kind of fancy stepping in these dances.
Sounds wonderful. And why don't you touch on the other two classes that you're planning on creating, which are going to start a few weeks later, not directly through us, but we are certainly going to make all the information available because I think you're going to be very excited about it. So go ahead and take a couple minutes about that.
Okay, so the other two classes are the things that are dear to my heart. One is going to be on dance reconstruction, probably with a focus on country dance reconstruction. This is going to be similar to a course I did at Pinewoods a number of years ago. I forget exactly what number of years it was, way back when. But we will actually look at the historical sources. I will scan them or photograph them and send you this actual physical information to look at and see how you get from those directions and from diagrams. Lindsay, maybe you could put that swing corners diagram back up on the screen for people really quickly.
Coming right up.
To see how you get from a picture like this, the picture that's coming, to an actual dance move. Okay, so this is the sort of information that I look at routinely when I'm doing reconstructions. This is early 19th century. The picture's from around 1815, I believe. But it's the sort of information we have so that we're not just guessing what they did. We actually have an enormous amount of information. And by putting that information together with the directions for dance figures, we can come up with pretty good reconstructions of what they would have done. So for people who don't know where to start on this, I'm going to help you get started. We'll start probably with Regency just because we have some of the best sources for that, but also look at some earlier and later country dance figures as well, and how you approach those figures and the different approaches you have to take working with figures from different time periods because country dance evolved over time. So that's one class. The second class is my ongoing project of finding people who can compose and call Regency country dances. And the only ways to really learn how to do that are either the way I did it, which is to do it 4 or 5 times a month for years until it becomes instinctive, or to actually study it, to actually try to do it. So that class is going to be a class on working with things like the playing cards or the diagrams and systems and charts that existed historically on how to create these country dances. Now, this is not going to turn you into a brilliant choreographer. You're not going to turn into Brooke Friendly or Gary Rudman or Pat Shaw or anything like that. What it's going to teach you is what Regency country dances looked like and how it's possible to compose them and call them more or less on the spot. And I guess my hope is that then eventually we'll all get out of quarantine and I will have taught enough people how to do this that I'll finally be able to get to a ball and not have to be the caller, that all the dancers can be in charge of this and we can all have that amazing experience together. But the only way that I have to share this is to actually teach people how to do it. So that'll be the second course. And both those latter two courses will probably be limited to 8 or 10 people so that I can actually work with you individually. You can share your work with everyone in a way that isn't possible with a giant mob of people. If the courses prove popular, then I guess I'll offer them again, because unfortunately it looks like I'm not going to have a lot of escape from my house over the next few months. So I'll have lots of time to stay home and offer courses.
That's
all
wonderful.
right.
Now, I am so excited. So we are a few minutes past our hour. We are going to be moving into the after chat where you'll be able to ask your questions directly with Susan. Thank you, Susan, for joining us. We really
You're welcome.
appreciate it.
It's been great fun.
Yes, please. I'm sorry, I'm running over you.
No, I just saying it's been great fun. I feel a little silly talking so much about myself, but I hope I've given people a sense of the kind of joy that I find in historical dance and dance reconstruction, and maybe enticed a few of them into wanting to know more about it or do more with it.
It's been wonderful, and I know the next hour will be wonderful too. You all know that Susan does do this for a living, so we are going to post to the link where you can support the work that Susan does. And we're going to close with another beautiful piece of music, one of Susan's favorites. She commissioned it by Spare Parts. It is the Royal Scotch Quadrilles Figure 5 by Bill and Liz and Eric, the Spare Parts Band. And you can't find this on their website, can you? This is private.
There's a link a link on their website, which will link you to my website. And you can actually buy this music from me if you're interested. It was a sort of work for hire piece. What the tunes are is a medley of 2 Neil Gow tunes, because these quadrilles were not published, so far we have not found published music for them. So when I reconstructed these quadrilles, I asked Spare Parts to choose historically accurate dance tunes and arrange them for the quadrille figures. So they chose a bunch of sets of Scottish dance music from the early 19th century that's documented into sources that old. And this is a medley of 2 Neil Gow tunes. I'm blanking on the names of them. I sent them to Darlene. Maybe she has them in front of her.
I posted them in the chat. And
perfect. Thank you.
I haven't posted them yet in the Facebook chat, but I will post both links for the opening and the closing in the chat. We're going to close now with the screen. I'm going to remind you all to join us Tuesday night when Orly Krasner joins us for our 5 Things Inside the Dancing Mind, an English country dance chat. Thank you so much. See you all in a few minutes. We're going to play out this music, and then we're going to open up the after talk. So stick around. You've got like 2 minutes. Thank you, and see you in just a couple minutes.
Thank you. Are we all proceeding to the after talk now?
That we are.
Okay, I'm gonna leave. I didn't want to leave before the party ended here. I'll see everyone on the after talk in a few minutes.
Thanks, Susan. See you in a minute.
Okay, bye-bye.